Hello, trackballs and Talon agents. My name is TB Skyen, and yeah, okay, let's talk about Sigma's feat. So Sigma is the latest Overwatch hero. Well, he's technically on the bad guys team, but he might not want to be. We don't exactly know what the full scope of his lore is, but his character model has been revealed, and for some reason, it's not wearing shoes. So there have been like a lot of reactions to his feat, which is, oh good lord, a sentence I'm apparently saying in 2019, and a lot of the discussion about whether or not a character in Overwatch should have bare feet. I don't really understand why, but an additional wrinkle was added to the situation earlier today when one artist who worked on Sigma got a comment on some concept art of Sigma where someone asked, could you please put shoes on this guy because I'm creeped out by feet for, I don't know, some reason. Some people are weird. And they responded, thanks for your feedback. We decided to keep the feet bare to sell the asylum look a bit more. In many institutions, patients are not allowed to have shoes because they might cause harm with the laces. While Sigma isn't necessarily in danger of that, we felt that having no shoes helped draw that connection. I also had iterations of him with shoes on, and it made him a lot more generic, so in the end we decided to leave him bare feet. That's just what the reasoning internally was, though I'm sure we'll be making skins with shoes on him in the future. So I want to stress up front, this is not official communication from Blizzard. This is an artist who happened to work on Sigma responding to a comment on their personal ArtStation page by giving an extremely brief summary of some of the internal discussions around Sigma. Like, they just gave us like the cliff notes, and maybe there have been extensive discussions around his character design internally. In fact, I'm sure there are, because, you know, big entertainment product, probably a lot of people who gave feedback on that kind of thing. So there's two things to kind of unpack here. First of all, Sigma has bare feet because bare feet is a relatively unusual thing, especially on a floating character like him who's otherwise covered in power armor. It's distinctive, it makes him stand out, it makes the character design more noticeable. I entirely agree with that. Aesthetically, it's a perfectly sensible choice to make him stand out, to make him a little bit odd, a little bit unusual. Where it gets a little bit more hairy is in the other part of the reasoning for Sigma's bare feet. Good lord, I'm making a video about this. Okay. According to the artist, they kept the bare feet to sell the asylum look a bit more. In many institutions, patients are not allowed to have shoes because they might cause harm with the laces. This is false. In modern healthcare institutions, at least the good ones, patients, even ones that are at risk for serious self-harm, are given footwear. Maybe they don't get to wear shoes with laces on them if they are at serious risk for causing self-harm, but they get footwear. They get like socks that, like non-slip socks so they can walk around safely on the floors, or like slippers, or some kind of shoe. Like, that's a thing people are given. So why was the idea of bare feet something that the artists thought, hey, how can we show that this guy is mentally disturbed? Oh right, we'll give him bare feet because that's the asylum look. Why does that trope and stereotype exist? Well, because while modern mental health care is generally based on compassion and humanism and respect for the individual patient, this was not always so. There is a reason that a mental health asylum is a popular destination for hacky horror movies and video games. Besides the long and absolutely bone-chillingly horrifying history of mental, physical, and sexual abuse of mental health patients, something that mental health patients for a very long time experience, and indeed in some places still experience to this day, is intense infantilization. That is to say, they are treated like children who cannot be trusted to make their own autonomous decisions about what they wear, where they go, who they talk to, how they behave, what they eat, and so on and so forth. And one of the ways in which mental health patients were sometimes infantilized was by saying, well, we can't trust you to have shoes, so we're just gonna take them away. And then they didn't give them anything else to wear on their feet. Like, the mental health patient asylum look that's being referenced here, it's a real thing, but it's a real thing with a really big, long, complicated, extremely ugly history behind it, which the character designers on Overwatch seem to have forgotten to have a critical think about before deciding to do it. See, because there's a couple of problems here. First of all, These practices of deprivation, of infantilization, they are generally considered outdated, outmoded, and indeed inhumane in modern mental health care, even though there's still cases even to this day of that kind of thing happening. But if it's outdated and outmoded by our perspective, then it should be positively Stone Age from the perspective of Sigma living in the post, singularity AI wars, robot, incredibly futuristic future. Like, why would any protocol of mental health care in 2100 and whatever involve taking away Sigma's shoes because they're afraid he's gonna hurt himself with his shoelaces? Do any characters in Overwatch have shoelaces? And if they, just give him Velcro shoes. Do they not have Velcro in the future? Do you not have, a magnetic locking do you not have those, Back to the Future shoes? The self-lacing, tightening ones that was sort of super cool in the 1980s? Do they not have those yet? So there's an anachronism there that is kind of confusing, and it's really weird to make the choice to include a detail that's going to cause that kind of discourse if you're not, if it's not really important to the character, if it's just an incidental, how can we show this guy is crazy? I know, bare feet, like those weirdos in the 1940s in the mental health asylums. Which leads us on neatly to the darker and somewhat more unpleasant part of this discussion, which is the potential actual harm that's being done here. Now, to be clear, the actual harm of one character in one video game having one little character design decision is minimal. I'm not here to argue that this one little thing in Overwatch, is a disaster, it's gonna cause the seas to rise and the lands to burn. On its own, it's practically nothing. It really doesn't matter on its own. But it's not on its own. It's part of a larger pattern in media. In media, we operate with tropes and stereotypes and archetypes. We've always done this, humans always do this, it's a completely normal thing, and on its own, it's fairly harmless. We establish archetypes for, if a character is like this, then they have these particular traits, and that's a visual shorthand that you can use to communicate to an audience that, hey, this character has this thing going on with them. So Reinhardt is a big tank, he can take a lot of punishment, well, let's make him physically big, give him these big armor plating and armor pieces, and give him this big, muscular body shape, and that's going to communicate to the audience that this guy's really sturdy and hard to kill. That's just basic visual coding. And this guy over here is a weirdo crazy person. He's got voices in his head and a split personality disorder. We don't know. We're gonna give him the asylum look. We have in culture a whole bunch of archetypes and stereotypes and tropes and visual signifiers that code mental illness for us. People who are depicted with mental illness are often depicted as being unkempt, or they're smelly, or they're weird, or they make weird movements with their body, or they can't control their speech, or they, have wild hair and crazy eyes. We have all kinds of visual tropes and stereotypes for what mental illness looks like. The problem with them is that they are all lies, and they are lies that can do actual, real-world, non-theoretical, provable, scientifically studyable, and quantifiable harm. And again, before anyone starts going into my comments and being weirdly aggressive about this, I'm not here making this video to demand that Sigma is given shoes because it's bigotry to have characters with bare feet. Nothing silly like that. Please be rational and reasonable about this and practice some critical thinking. I'm trying to place Sigma into a wider cultural context around the discipline of character design, around the subject of how we visually represent the idea of mental illness. Because when it is done poorly, when it is done with glib archetypes and stereotypes and visual references to the abusive mental health practices of 60 years ago, it can cause genuine harm. And not from any one character, not from one Overwatch character having bare feet. It doesn't cause suicides to happen or something crazy like that. No one individual thing does it, but in aggregate, as a total summation of the ways in which we do these things systemically, they cause real harm. There is a ton of stigma around mental health already. And I know this personally because I am a person who suffers from mental illness. Not fortunately, and I thank God for this debilitatingly severe mental illness, but I struggle with occasional depression and periodical anxiety. These are fairly common afflictions. A lot of people struggle with the exact same things. None of that makes me special. And what's also not special is my reluctance to seek help for these problems. When I began to slowly realize that maybe something was not quite right with my brain and it was ruining my life, I didn't want to go and seek help because I didn't want to be a mentally ill person. I didn't want that stigma. I didn't want to be that crazy weirdo with the wild eyes and the crazy hair and the unkempt beard and the smelly guy who makes weird movements on the train. I didn't want to be that freak. And that image of the freak in my mind, it didn't just show up out of nowhere. I absorbed it from culture. I absorbed it from media. I absorbed it from the ways in which mental health are represented in the world around me. And this is absolutely not unique to me. Mental health stigma is an incredibly well-studied field of knowledge. There's actual scientific papers about this shit. And the scientific consensus is that mental health stigma kills people. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. Mental health stigma prevents people from seeking treatment that they desperately need, and people with mental illness who do not seek treatment are, and this should be pretty logical, much more likely to have severe negative health outcomes from their mental illnesses. When we give mental illness a look, an asylum look, or whatever that look may be, we do two things, I think, primarily. First of all, people who may have mental health issues but don't realize it are going to go, oh well, but I can't be mentally ill. I don't look like someone who's mentally ill. I don't have those outward signs and symptoms of being a crazy person, so I clearly don't need help because what's wrong with me doesn't look like what I think mental illness is supposed to look like. And the other effect is that people who understand that they may have mental illnesses and mental problems don't want to seek help because they are afraid of the stigma. They are afraid of becoming the stereotypes that they think of when they think of mental illness. I don't want to be the freak. I don't want to be the weirdo. I don't want to be mentally ill. I'm not gonna get a diagnosis. And again, for those who have not been paying attention, none of this is the fault of Overwatch. None of this is the fault of Sigma. None of this is the fault of his particular bare feet. He's only one tiny piece of the larger puzzle that I'm trying to tell you about. So if you want a point to take away from this, my point is, it is possible to make perfectly sensible character design decisions using the tools that you have available. The tropes, the visual signifiers, the codings that are available to show various things to the audience. It's possible to make a perfectly sensible decision like saying, okay, this scientist guy who controls gravity and floats in the air, we need a visual signifier to show that he's mentally unwell. I know, we'll reference the asylum look. That's gonna tell the audience that this guy is a crazy person. Absent all other context, absent all of the stuff we've been talking about, that's a perfectly sensible character design decision because it does a good job of communicating the information that you want to the audience who are supposed to consume it. But sometimes decisions that are technically and artistically perfectly sound and sensible can have ethical ramifications that can get you into a lot of hot water and cause a lot of negative criticisms and a lot of discourse that you don't want and you don't need and your game was never intended to generate. And if you're an independent, small creator, of course you can't research every single aspect of every single character design decision that you ever make to exhaustive detail to make sure that you're never ever stepping, pardon the pun, on anyone's toes. Of course not. That's an unreasonable expectation. But when you are Activision Blizzard, multinational, multi-billion-dollar entertainment conglomerate, which earns billions of dollars selling video games all over the world, then you do have a responsibility, I think, to be more conscientious than the average creator about the pieces of media that you put out. To put your massive bank of resources to use to make sure that the products you're creating aren't causing unintentional harm, even if it's in very small ways. Anyway, that was a video about Sigma's goddamn feet. If you've enjoyed this video, yada yada yada, like, comment, subscribe, YouTube stuff. I'm not really feeling especially in the mood to do a whole bunch of self-promotion here, so, you know, Patreon if you want, don't if you don't wanna, hit the dislike button, I guess.